I was 20 years old when I walked into the Hürtgen Forest in November of 1944, carrying 60 pounds of gear and a rifle I'd fired maybe 300 times in training, and I remember thinking the trees looked like they could swallow the entire war and never spit it back out. My name was Private First Class Robert Mitchell, and I was assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 28th Infantry Division, which everyone called the Bloody Bucket because of our red keystone shoulder patch, though by the time we got to Hürtgen, most of us figured the name fit for darker reasons than just some goddamn insignia. The forest was different from anything they'd shown us in the training films back at Fort Benning, where they made everything look clean and tactical, with clear fields of fire and defined positions, and officers who knew what the hell they were doing. This place was nothing but pine trees so thick you couldn't see 20 yards in any direction, mud that sucked at your boots with every step, and a cold that worked its way through every layer you wore until your bones felt like ice. The Germans had been here for years, knew every trail and ridge and hollow, and they'd turned the whole goddamn forest into a killing ground with mines and booby traps and interlocking fields of fire that could shred a company before you even saw where the shooting was coming from. Sergeant Thomas Brennan was my squad leader, a guy from Philadelphia who'd been in North Africa and Sicily and had this way of looking at terrain like he could read what was going to happen before it did. And he told us on the first night that Hürtgen was going to be worse than anything we'd seen or heard about. "The trees are the enemy as much as the Krauts," he said, while we dug in near some shot-up pillbox that probably dated back to the Siegfried Line. "Artillery hits the trees, and the trees explode into wooden shrapnel that'll cut you in half. Stay low, stay spread out, and don't bunch up for any fucking reason." We'd been in the forest for 3 days, when I first heard the sound that would become the soundtrack to my nightmares for the next 60 years, which was the metallic grinding of tank treads on frozen ground, mixed with the low rumble of diesel engines. And it came from somewhere ahead of us in the fog that settled over the forest every morning, like a blanket made of cold breath. We were holding a position along what used to be a logging road, maybe a mile and a half southeast of a town called Vossenack, and our orders were to maintain the line and prevent any German counterattacks from pushing us back toward the Call River Trail we'd fought to take the day before. I'd been trained on the M1A1 Bazooka back in basic, which meant I'd fired it exactly 4 times at stationary targets on a range where nobody was shooting back, and now I was carrying the damn thing along with 30 pounds of rockets because our regular bazooka man, a kid named Phillips from Iowa, had stepped on a mine 2 days earlier and was scattered across 20 feet of forest floor in pieces too small to identify. Brennan had looked at me that morning and said, "Mitchell, you're on the tube now," and handed me the launcher like he was giving me a death sentence, which I guess in a way he was. The bazooka was a simple weapon in theory, a 5-foot steel tube that fired a rocket-propelled shaped charge designed to punch through armor. But in practice, it was a bastard to use under combat conditions because you had to get close, real close, within a couple hundred yards to have any chance of a kill, and you had to expose yourself to fire it because the backblast would give away your position instantly, and the reload time was long enough for any competent enemy to zero in on you. The M1A1 model we had weighed about 15 pounds empty, and each rocket added another 3.5 pounds, and I was carrying 6 of them in a canvas bag that kept catching on every goddamn branch and vine in the forest. The morning they came at us started like every other morning in that hellhole, which is to say it was cold enough to make your teeth hurt, foggy enough that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and quiet in that particular way that meant something bad was building just beyond your line of sight. We'd been awake since 0400, manning our positions in foxholes that were more mud than earth, taking turns on watch while the rest of the squad tried to grab a few minutes of sleep that never really came, because your body wouldn't let you relax enough to actually rest when you knew that at any second the world could explode around you. Corporal Daniels, who was acting as our forward observer, came crawling back from his position, about 50 yards up the trail around 0630, and his face had that particular shade of pale that meant he'd seen something that scared him, which took a lot, because Daniels had been in this shit since Normandy and didn't scare easy. "Sergeant," he whispered, even though the nearest Germans were probably too far away to hear normal conversation, "I got movement. Heavy movement. Sounds like armor. Multiple vehicles coming up from the valley." Brennan didn't waste time asking questions. He just started issuing orders in that low, calm voice that made you think maybe you had a chance of surviving whatever was coming, even when you knew deep down that you probably didn't. "Spread out 20-yard intervals. "Daniels, take the MG up to that big pine and set up a position with interlocking fire to Mitchell's bazooka. Mitchell, you're our anti-tank. Pick a spot with good cover and a clear field of fire down the road. Wait for them to close to under 200 yards. First shot has to count because you won't get a second one." I moved to a position behind a fallen pine tree that gave me a decent view of maybe 150 yards down the logging road, which had been churned into a river of frozen mud by our own supply trucks earlier in the week. And I set up the bazooka with shaking hands that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the fact that I was about to face German armor with a weapon I barely knew how to use. My assistant gunner was a replacement named Harris, who joined us 3 days earlier and looked like he was about 16 years old, though he claimed he was 19, and his job was to load the rockets and watch my back while I took the shot. The sound got louder over the next 10 minutes, that distinctive rumble of heavy vehicles moving slowly through difficult terrain, and then through the fog I started to see shapes, dark and angular, moving with mechanical precision down what was left of the road. The lead vehicle emerged from the mist like something from a nightmare. A German Panzer IV with its long 75mm gun traversing slowly from side to side, searching for targets, followed by at least 2 more tanks that I could make out, and probably more behind them that were still hidden in the fog. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs from the inside, and my hands were slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature, and Harris was pressed against the log next to me, breathing so fast and shallow I was worried he might pass out. The lead Panzer was maybe 200 yards out, moving at walking speed, and I could see German infantry moving alongside it in the trees, maybe 20 or 30 soldiers in field grey uniforms with their weapons at the ready, scanning the forest for exactly the kind of ambush they were walking into. Brennan's voice came from somewhere to my left, barely louder than the wind. "Hold! Wait for my signal. Mitchell, you take the lead tank. MG, you suppress the infantry. Everybody else pick your targets and wait for Mitchell's shot." The Panzer kept coming, tracks throwing up frozen mud, exhaust mixing with the fog, and I could see the commander standing in the turret hatch with binoculars, sweeping the tree line, and I had this insane thought that if he looked directly at me, if our eyes met across that 150 yards of no man's land, maybe he'd see that I was just a scared kid from Ohio who'd never hurt anybody before this war, and maybe he'd order his driver to turn around and go home, and we could all just stop. This madness right here and now, but of course that didn't happen. The tank kept advancing, and when it reached the spot where I'd mentally marked as my firing point, about 150 yards, close enough that even my limited training gave me a decent chance of a hit, Brennan gave the signal. "Now. Hit them now." I rose from behind the log, shouldered the bazooka, and sighted down the tube at the lead Panzer, which suddenly looked a lot bigger and more terrifying than any target I'd ever shot at in training, and I focused on the front glacis plate below. The turret, which was the sweet spot where the armor was thinnest and a shaped charge had the best chance of penetrating. Harris was right behind me, already loading the second rocket even though I hadn't fired the first, and I took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket motor ignited with a whoosh that was loud enough to wake the dead, and the backblast scorched the ground behind me and probably would have killed Harris if he hadn't been positioned correctly. And the rocket streaked across the space between me and the Panzer in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. I watched the projectile track straight and true, a line of white smoke connecting my position to the target, and then it hit with a sound like a massive hammer striking an anvil, right where I'd aimed, and the shaped charge punched through the armor and detonated inside the tank with enough force to blow the turret hatches open and send a gout of flame and smoke erupting from every opening in the vehicle. The Panzer lurched to a stop, its engine still running but the crew either dead or dying inside. And that's when all hell broke loose around us, because the German infantry had spotted the rocket trail, and the MG on our left had opened up, and every rifle in our platoon was firing at once, and the trees were filled with the sound of bullets hitting wood, and men screaming, and return fire from German weapons that had a different, sharper crack than our M1s. The second Panzer in the column immediately traversed its turret toward my position, and I knew I had maybe 5 seconds before that 75mm gun found me and erased me from existence. So I dropped behind the log and yelled at Harris to load another rocket while I tried to control my breathing and stop my hands from shaking enough to make the next shot. The German tank fired, and the round hit somewhere behind us with an explosion that threw dirt and branches everywhere, and the concussion was strong enough to knock Harris sideways and rattle my teeth. But we were still alive, and I still had a job to do. I came up again, this time aiming at the second Panzer, which was trying to maneuver around the burning wreck of the lead tank, and I fired almost without thinking, purely on instinct and muscle memory, and the rocket hit the turret's side armor at an angle that was less than ideal, but still managed to penetrate and cause some kind of catastrophic secondary explosion that suggested I'd hit the ammunition storage. The Panzer stopped dead, smoke pouring from its hatches, and I heard men screaming inside in German, and part of me felt sick about it, while another part of me felt nothing at all except the desperate need to survive the next 5 minutes. The third tank in the column decided it had had enough and started backing up, its commander apparently deciding that advancing into an ambush with 2 tanks already burning wasn't worth whatever tactical objective they'd been sent to achieve, and the German infantry started pulling back too, dragging their wounded and laying down covering fire that was intense enough to keep all of us pinned for several minutes. Daniel's MG was hammering away, brass casings flying, and I could hear Brennan shouting orders to cease fire and conserve ammunition because we didn't know if this was a probe or the prelude to a bigger attack. The whole engagement lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours, and when the Germans finally pulled back beyond effective range and the shooting stopped, the sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been, because now you could hear the men crying for medics, and the crackling of the burning tanks and the wet gurgling sounds that men make when they're dying from chest wounds. I stayed behind the log, bazooka still loaded, scanning the fog for any sign of another attack, while Harris sat next to me with his eyes wide and his whole body shaking, and his hands covered in blood from where the backblast from one of our shots had torn up his palms on the rough ground when he'd fallen. Brennan came crawling over to our position about 15 minutes later, after he'd checked on the rest of the squad, and made sure we weren't about to get flanked or overrun, and he looked at the 2 burning Panzers visible through the fog, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Good shooting, Mitchell," he said, which was about as effusive as Brennan ever got. "You just saved a lot of lives, but that was probably just their reconnaissance element, and when they figure out we're here in force, they're going to come back with a lot more than 3 tanks and a platoon of infantry." He was right, of course. We'd stopped their initial probe, but we'd also revealed our position and our strength, and now the Germans knew exactly where to concentrate their next attack, and they had a hell of a lot more resources than we did because Hürtgen was their ground, and they'd been preparing defensive positions here for years, while we were just trying to push through to the Roa River dams without getting chewed up in the process. The rest of that day was a blur of digging deeper foxholes, redistributing ammunition, treating wounded, and waiting for the inevitable counterattack that we all knew was coming but couldn't predict when or from which direction. I kept the bazooka ready, cleaned it, checked the rockets, and tried not to think about the fact that I'd just killed somewhere between 6 and 8 men, the crews of those 2 Panzers, and that if I closed my eyes, I could still see the moment when the second tank's turret hatches blew open and the fire erupted, and I could imagine too clearly what it must have been like inside that steel coffin in the seconds before they died. The Germans came back that night around 2300, and this time they came with infantry first, probing our lines with small unit tactics, trying to find our weak points, and we lost 2 men to sniper fire before Brennan finally got permission to pull back about 300 yards to a better defensive position on higher ground. We moved in the darkness, carrying our wounded and as much ammunition as we could, leaving behind our dead because there wasn't time to recover them, and I remember thinking that this was what hell probably looked like, cold and dark and full of invisible enemies who wanted to kill you and dead men you couldn't bury, and the constant fear that the next step might be your last, because the whole forest was mined and booby-trapped, and you never knew where was safe. We held that new position for 3 more days, fighting off repeated German attacks that came at all hours and from all directions, and somewhere in that time I fired the bazooka twice more, once at a Panther tank that managed to get within 100 yards before I hit it in the track and immobilized it, and once at what I thought was another Panzer, but turned out to be a Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun that took the rocket to its frontal armor and shrugged it off like it was nothing. And I had to scramble to a new position, while that 75mm gun searched for me and found Harris instead, turning him into red mist with a direct hit that left nothing to bury or identify. I stopped sleeping after Harris died. I'd catch maybe an hour here or there when my body literally couldn't stay awake anymore. But mostly I just sat in my foxhole at night, holding the bazooka, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to distinguish between the wind in the trees and German infiltrators, and the ghosts of all the men who died in this godforsaken place over the past weeks. Brennan noticed, because Brennan noticed everything, and he tried to get me rotated back for rest, but there wasn't anyone to replace me, and the bazooka was our only anti-tank capability, and so I stayed on the line and kept firing rockets at German armor whenever it appeared, and tried not to think about what I was turning into. The thing about war that nobody really explains is how quickly you stop being the person you were and start being something else, something harder and colder and more mechanical, like your humanity is just another piece of equipment you shed to make room for the ammunition and the hatred and the pure survival instinct that keeps you moving when every rational part of your brain is screaming at you to just lie down and give up. I'd been raised Catholic, went to church every Sunday back in Cleveland, believed in the sanctity of human life and the commandment against killing, and now I was lying in frozen mud, calculating the best angle to punch a rocket through a tank's armor to incinerate the men inside, and I felt nothing about it except a grim satisfaction when I made a good shot. We finally got pulled off the line on November 19th, after 2 weeks of constant combat that had reduced Company K from about 200 men to maybe 70 who were still combat effective, and they trucked us back to a rear area near Schmidt, where we were supposed to rest and refit and absorb replacements. I remember sitting in the back of that deuce and a half, covered in mud and dried blood, with the bazooka across my lap, and my eyes so hollow that the other survivors in the truck wouldn't look at me, and thinking that I should feel relieved or grateful to be alive, but feeling instead like I'd left something essential behind in those woods, some part of myself that would never grow back. They gave us hot food and clean uniforms, and a tent with cots and blankets, and it felt wrong somehow, like we didn't deserve comfort when so many others were still out there dying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying the dead by surviving and by eating hot chow and by sleeping in a tent instead of a frozen foxhole. A chaplain came around that evening, wanted to talk, wanted to offer comfort or absolution or whatever it is chaplains are supposed to offer, but I couldn't find the words to explain to him what we'd seen and done, and eventually he just gave me a sad look and moved on to the next man. I got a Bronze Star for the action, where I'd knocked out those 2 Panzers, though I didn't learn about it until months later, because they didn't present medals in the field where we were. They just noted it in your file and maybe told your squad leader, and that was that. I never wore the medal, kept it in a box in my basement for 60 years before I finally threw it away, because I didn't want my grandkids asking me what I'd done to earn it, and having to explain that I'd killed men for a living when I was barely older than they were. The Hürtgen Forest campaign continued for months after we got pulled out, chewing up division after division, and the casualty rates were obscene, something like 33% killed, wounded, or captured, which was higher than almost any other battle the US Army fought in Europe. The official history called it a tactical defeat and a strategic blunder, and the veterans called it hell on earth, and the Germans called it the death factory, and all those descriptions were accurate, but none of them really captured what it was like to be there, to live it, to survive it, and carry it with you for the rest of your life. I spent the rest of the war in Europe, fought through the Battle of the Bulge and across Germany until VE Day, and I survived every engagement and came home in one piece physically, but the nightmares started almost immediately and never really stopped. For decades I'd wake up at night, hearing the sound of tank treads on frozen ground, smelling diesel exhaust and cordite, and the particular stench of burning flesh that comes from a direct hit on an armored vehicle, feeling the weight of that bazooka in my hands and the kick when it fired, and the absolute certainty that the next second would be my last. I got married in 1947, had 3 kids, worked for 35 years at a steel mill in Cleveland, lived what everybody else would call a normal life, but there was always this shadow over everything, this weight that I carried that I could never quite explain to my wife or my children or anyone who hadn't been there. I'd be at a family picnic on a summer day, and I'd hear a car backfire, and suddenly I'd be back in Hürtgen diving for cover, reaching for a weapon I hadn't carried in decades, and it would take minutes for my heart to stop racing and for the present to become real again. The Department of Veterans Affairs diagnosed me with what they now call PTSD, though back in my day they called it combat fatigue or shell shock or just weakness, and they gave me some pills that made me feel disconnected from everything and some therapy sessions with well-meaning counselors who'd never heard a shot fired in anger and couldn't understand why I couldn't just move past experiences that had happened 50 years ago. The truth is, you don't move past something like Hürtgen. You learn to live with it, to carry it, to build a life around the hole it left in you, but it never goes away, never gets better, never stops hurting. I lost touch with most of my squad over the years. Brennan died in Korea, re-enlisted after the war because he couldn't adjust to civilian life, and ended up taking a Chinese bullet in some frozen valley whose name I can't remember. Daniels made it home but drank himself to death by 1952, and the last time I saw him, he barely recognized me, his eyes as hollow as they'd been in Hürtgen, but without any of the focus or purpose that had kept him alive there. Most of the replacements we'd absorbed over those months were just names and faces I could barely recall, kids who'd lasted days or weeks before becoming casualties in a battle that history has mostly forgotten. There's a cemetery in Belgium where a lot of the Hürtgen casualties are buried, and I went there once in 1984 when my wife convinced me that maybe facing it would help with the nightmares. I walked among the white crosses, reading names I vaguely recognized, and I found Harris's grave, which was marked with his full name, Private Ronald James Harris, age 19, killed November 16, 1944. And I stood there for an hour trying to find something to say, some words that would make sense of why he died at 19 loading rockets for me, while I got to live to 60 and have grandchildren and a pension and a house in the suburbs. I couldn't find those words then, and I haven't found them in the 30-some years since. What I did find standing in that cemetery was a kind of acceptance that some things don't make sense, that some experiences can't be rationalized or justified or explained, that sometimes you just survive when others don't, and you carry that survival like a weight for the rest of your life, and you try to honor the dead by living as well as you can, even when part of you wishes you'd died with them in that frozen forest in Germany. The nightmares have gotten worse as I've gotten older, more vivid, more frequent, like my brain is preparing for whatever comes next, by replaying all the worst moments of my life on an endless loop. I see the face of that German tank commander in the turret of that 1st Panzer, young guy, maybe 25, with binoculars, and I watch my rocket hit his tank and I imagine his last seconds, and I wonder about his family, about whether they ever found out what happened to him, or if he's just listed as missing somewhere. Another casualty of a war that ended 75 years ago, but still won't let go of those of us who fought it. My wife died 3 years ago, and my kids have families of their own now, and I live alone in a small apartment in Cleveland Heights, and most days I'm fine, functioning, just another old man collecting Social Security and watching too much television. But sometimes, usually in the early morning hours when the world is quiet and dark, I'm 20 years old again, crouched behind a fallen log in Hürtgen Forest, watching German armor roll toward my position, feeling the weight of the bazooka in my hands, and knowing that the next few seconds will determine whether I live or die. And I take that shot again, and I watch the tank burn, and I hear the screams, and I survive another day in a battle that claimed so many thousands of lives for such little strategic gain. The historians call Hürtgen a failure, and they're right. We were supposed to take the forest quickly, push through to the Ruhr dams, prevent the Germans from using the high ground to threaten our advance into Germany. Instead, we spent months grinding away at prepared defenses in terrible terrain, under worse weather conditions, taking casualties we couldn't afford, for objectives we couldn't hold, in a battle that should never have been fought the way it was fought. But knowing that doesn't change the experience of being there, doesn't make the memories less vivid, doesn't bring back the dead or heal the survivors. I'm 94 years old now, and I don't have much time left, and I've spent most of my life trying not to talk about Hürtgen, trying to bury those memories as deep as they'll go. But lately, I've felt this need to tell someone what it was really like. Not the sanitized version you see in history books or war movies, but the raw truth of it. The fear and the cold and the mud and the sound of men dying and the weight of survival and the impossibility of ever really coming home from something like that. I knocked out 3 German tanks in the Hürtgen Forest in November of 1944, and I survived battles that killed most of my unit, and I came home and built a life and tried to be a good husband and father and citizen. But there's a part of me that never left those woods, That's still 20 years old and terrified, and holding a bazooka and watching armor roll through the fog, and that part of me will die when I die, and will take with it memories that nobody should have to carry, but that somebody has to remember, because forgetting would be an even greater betrayal of the men who didn't make it home. The things I saw, the things I did, the choices I made, they're not the kind of things you can explain to people who weren't there. How do you describe the weight of being responsible for other men's survival? How do you convey the experience of killing someone you've never met? Because if you don't kill him first, he'll kill you. How do you reconcile the person you were raised to be with the person war forced you to become? You don't. You just live with it, carry it, and hope that somehow it meant something, that the sacrifice and the suffering and the dying served some purpose beyond just the perpetuation of more sacrifice and suffering and dying. I don't know if that German tank commander had a family waiting for him back home, or if the men in those panzers I destroyed were conscripts or volunteers, Nazis or just soldiers doing their duty. And in some ways it doesn't matter, because dead is dead, and I put them in the ground regardless of who they were or what they believed. But in other ways it matters tremendously, because they were human beings, with lives and hopes and fears just like mine. And I ended those lives from 150 yards away with a weapon I barely knew how to use, and I've carried that knowledge with me for 75 years, and it's shaped everything about who I became and how I lived, and what kind of man I was to my family. The official after-action report for that engagement probably says something bland and technical about anti-tank operations and successful defensive action, and my Bronze Star citation probably uses words like valor and courage and dedication to duty. But the truth is, I was just a scared kid trying to survive, doing what I was trained to do because the alternative was death, and the fact that I was good at it, that I could make those shots under pressure and kill those men without hesitation, says something about human nature that I've never been comfortable thinking about too deeply. War changes you in ways that are permanent and profound, and you can't go back to being the person you were before, can't reclaim that innocence or that faith in the fundamental goodness of the world, because you've seen what humans are capable of doing to each other when the usual restraints are removed and violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. The kid who walked into Hürtgen Forest in November 1944 believed in right and wrong, good and evil, the righteousness of our cause and the evil of the enemy. The man who walked out of there 10 days later understood that war is mostly just killing and dying and suffering. That righteousness is a luxury you can't afford when you're trying not to freeze to death in a muddy foxhole, and that the enemy is just other scared kids trying to survive the same hell you're trapped in. I've lived a long life, longer than I probably deserved given how many better men died in that forest, and I've tried to do right by their memory by being a decent person, by contributing to my community, by raising children who understood the value of peace, even though I could never fully explain to them the cost of war. But there's this voice in my head, this whisper that never goes away, that asks whether it was worth it, whether the objectives we achieved justified the losses we took, whether my survival served any purpose beyond allowing me to carry these memories forward into a future that has mostly forgotten the lessons we learned in Blood and Fire. The last time I had the nightmare, the one where I'm back behind that log with the bazooka and the panzers are rolling toward me and I can't make the shot and they just keep coming, I woke up crying, which doesn't happen often anymore because I learned decades ago how to lock that part of myself away. But sometimes the walls you build to protect yourself crack and everything comes flooding out, and you're reduced to an old man weeping in the darkness for friends dead 70 years and choices made when you were too young to understand their full weight. I tell myself it meant something, that we stopped the Germans from breaking through, that we held the line long enough for the bigger strategic picture to develop, that those tanks I destroyed would have killed American soldiers if I hadn't stopped them, and all of that is probably true. But it doesn't change the fact that I killed men, ended lives, destroyed futures, and I did it efficiently and effectively, and without hesitation, and that capacity for violence, that ability to switch off your humanity and become a weapon, is something that once you develop it, you can never fully put away. This is what I want people to understand about war, about combat, about what it really means to serve. It's not the glory or the heroism or the camaraderie, though those things exist. It's the permanent alteration of who you are at your core, the knowledge that you're capable of things you never imagined, the understanding that survival sometimes requires you to do things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. And you carry that. You live with it, you build whatever life you can around it, but you never escape it, never fully recover from it, never stop being that scared kid in the frozen forest with a bazooka and a target, and 3 seconds to decide between life and death. I knocked out 3 German tanks at Hürtgen Forest in November 1944, and I survived when so many others didn't. And I've spent 75 years trying to make peace with that fact, and I still haven't found it. Maybe that's the real lesson, that some wounds never heal, some scars never fade, some memories never lose their power to transport you back to the worst moments of your life. You just learn to live with them, to function despite them, to find meaning and purpose in spite of them. And you hope that by telling your story, by bearing witness to what you experienced and what you did, you can help prevent the next generation from having to learn the same terrible lessons in the same terrible ways. But I'm not optimistic about that. Wars keep happening, young men keep dying, and each generation seems to need to learn for itself that war is hell and survival is luck, and the cost is measured in nightmares that never end and memories that never fade. All I can do is tell you what it was like, what it cost, what it took from me and everyone I served with, and hope that somehow, somewhere, someone hears it and understands that the price of war is measured not just in bodies counted and territory gained, but in souls damaged beyond repair and futures stolen before they could begin. I was 20 years old when I walked into Hürtgen Forest, and I'm 94 years old now, and part of me has never left those woods and never will. That's what war does. It takes you to places you can never really leave, shows you things you can never unsee, makes you into someone you can never unmake. And you carry that until the day you die, and maybe even after, and you hope that it meant something, that the sacrifice served a purpose, that the dying wasn't entirely in vain. But mostly you just remember, and you live with the remembering, and you try to honor the dead by being someone they wouldn't be ashamed to have survived when they didn't.